Spoštovani gostje, dobrodošli na posebnem pogovoru z gospodom Rodolfom Cattanijem in gospod Tanjo Dular. Gre za projekt, ki je delno podprt strani Urada Vlade Republike Slovenije za komuniciranje, gre pa za prireditev študentske založbe ob letu evropskih državljanov, ki je zelo pomembno leto, ker, kot vemo, vsi smo državljani Evrope, tudi Evrope. Enakost je pogoj za svobodo vseh, ne le samo nekaterih, zato je zelo pomembno, da slišimo tudi močne, odločne glasove razuma. Gospod Cattani, ki je naš posebni gost, danes je zagotovo en izmed najmočnejših glasov v Evropi, predvsem, ko gre za pravice invalidov. Z nami je tudi gospa Tanja Dular, sekretarka z pristojnega direktorata Ministrstva za delo, družino in socialne zadeve. Gospod Cattani pa je, če gre za funkcije, od leta 2009 sekretar European Disability Foruma, se pravi osrednje evropske organizacije invalidov, sicer pa je že desetletja aktiven tudi v EBU-ju, se pravi v European Blind Union, Evropski zvezi slepih. Mr. Cattani, it is a great honor to have you here. As I said, you are the voice of European citizens in general, because we are one, we're all citizens, and we need equality of all to be free. There can be no exceptions, especially not in Europe, which is one of the most developed parts of the world, and where we would suggest, and we would also hope that the possibilities of disabled persons are definitely mostly developed. But could you give us the update of the European Accessibility Act, because it's a topic which was on agenda for several years. We know that the assessment study seems to be coming to an end. Where do we stand now? Can we expect improvements this year?
Well, I would say that this year we will probably not have very significant results. I would first of all thank the Slovenian Association to invite me here to this important conference. I have prepared some notes, of course, just to concentrate as much as possible my ideas in order to have the maximum of communication. And so, if you allow me a short introduction, I would say that what we are aiming at is, first of all, a rights-based approach. And when I speak about a rights-based approach, I think about human dignity. You mentioned already equality for all, in particular gender equality, respect for diversity, so that all groups are represented and all groups are heard in society, solidarity, freedom, social justice, sustainability, transparency, and participatory democracy. How is the situation regarding all these important issues? If we look at the situation, we see that if we fight for equality for all, we think of eradication of discrimination, first of all, realization of equality in all areas of life. We think about strong protection and welfare systems. We think about socio-economic justice, which means elimination of all forms of inequalities in this field. And then for all people, but in particular for persons with disabilities, a decent work, and the qualitative employment, so that the services are centered to the person and are oriented towards the common good. So we want that ensure universal access to qualitative, affordable, and accessible public and social services. Well, the social situation in Europe is worrying, as there is a general recession trend, and due to the lack of growth, the social situation and the living conditions of the majority of the European citizens have not been improving as much as it was expected. In the last years, the EU priorities have been characterized by fiscal consolidation and austerity regulations that have failed on the poorest in our society. 130,000 is an enormous number of people who are poor in the rich European Union. And I remember when I was in China last year, they said, "Oh, you see, China is rich, but Chinese are poor." And we are more or less in the same situation. Too many people are poor. The GDP is shrinking by 0.3%. Austerity policies contribute to have dramatic consequences. So many member states implemented austerity measures by cutting expenditure, especially, and this is dangerous for us, for social and health services, social protection, and also education. So I see that, you see that the situation is not very favorable to obtain important and significant results in a so short time as by the end of this year. So I think that my first answer to your question would be no. The situation is not positive enough, and we are faced not with progress, but in general with regression.
But how could we change this? Because there are some procedural problems, especially regarding this assessment study. So, okay, we have the crisis also here in Slovenia. Italy is also affected. Some parts of Europe are definitely not as affected as the southern parts. But is this only a problem of the current economic crisis, or is there more behind?
Yes, I think that there is more behind, because there is a kind of social deterioration. And next year, for example, we will have the election of the new European Parliament. And there is the risk, for example, that in the new European Parliament we will have the right wings of our society. In April 2013, the European Social Protection Committee, which is an important institution, warned against the increasing poverty levels in the EU and identified also what it would be the figure, the trend to watch at EU level, and increasing poverty and social exclusion for the overall population. What does it mean? How can we fight against this? We can fight against this with political and just political decisions to put money to put money in society and to make this money circulate And we can have growth only if austerity is overcome, because austerity is killing the social system. And this is an old idea of the liberal school of Chicago, the so-called Chicago boys, who think that if you beat strongly a society, the society will wake up and will produce from itself the development. But it is historically demonstrated that this theory is absolutely wrong. And thinking about the title and the argument of our meeting today, I would say that there is a clear and urgent need to improve the participation of citizens and the possibility for citizens to really express their view and to organize themselves in order to influence strongly the decision makers in their countries.
Okay, Mr. Cattani, we'll come back later because you mentioned the Chicago boys. I can remember another group of Chicago boys who were active in the 30s, and they ended not quite well. Some of them suffered because they didn't pay taxes. But okay, let us rest here. I would like to give the floor also to Mrs. Dular to give us some Slovenian perspective of the problems you opened. Torej, gospa Dular, slišali smo gospoda Cattanija, to so bile zelo odločne, močne besede. V Sloveniji smo seveda soočeni z zelo podobnimi stvarmi, predvsem posegi ali pa željami posegov na socialno področje, tudi na področje dela. To je vaše področje. Kako v Sloveniji stojimo trenutno in v kakšni nevarnosti dejansko so naši sodržavljani z omejitvami?
Hvala lepa za vaše vprašanje. Najprej bi izkoristila to priložnost in vse lepo pozdravila in se vam zahvalila za vašo udeležbo tukaj. Drugače pa, da se vrnem na vprašanje. Seveda, kot ste že povedali, je tudi Slovenija globoko v ekonomski krizi in smo del Evrope. Lahko rečem, da smo pravzaprav v tej krizi morda še bolj kot katera druga evropska država. Ne bom rekla, da najbolj od vseh, ampak sigurno pa kar precej. In moram reči, da normalno, da tudi vse državljanke in državljani občutimo to krizo, tudi predvsem in seveda tudi invalidi. Kar se tiče zaposlovanja, bi rekla pa naslednje. Tukaj, naprimer, bi poudarila to, da ne glede na to, kot sami veste, da je rast brezposelnosti zelo velika v Sloveniji, da pravzaprav je vedno več stečajev, da gre vedno več firm v stečaje, da je vedno več ljudi na cesti, da tukaj lahko rečem, da smo pa, kar se tiče na področju zaposlovanja invalidov, na nek način, ne bom rekla odlični, ampak približno uspešni, saj pravzaprav procent zaposlenih invalidov tudi ne glede na krizo ne pada, to se pravi, da je ostal enak, kot je bil pred krizo. To bi rekla, je že nekako na tem področju boljši kazalnik. Seveda s tem nismo zadovoljni. Tudi jaz bi hotela in seveda tudi država, da bi bilo vedno več zaposlitev in da bi bilo tudi čim več zaposlenih invalidov. Predvsej je k sami zaposlenosti invalidov predvsej pripomore tudi kvotni sistem, ki pravzaprav delodajalce, bom rekla, na nek način v narekovajih prisili, da zaposlujejo invalide, ker bi morali drugače pač plačevati.
Se recimo reči spodbujati.
Spodbujati, a ne, invalide, ker drugače bi morali pač plačevati, morajo plačevati poseben prispevek v sklad. Mogoče je to eden od načinov, da se je dejansko tudi ta raven zaposlenosti invalidov obdržala. Zavedamo pa se ene stvari, da pravzaprav tako kot tudi drugi so tudi invalidi vedno slabše plačani. Plače se nižajo, plače so slabše in problem je še eden. Problem je v tem, da tudi tisti, ki so zaposleni, pravzaprav dostikrat, tudi če dobivajo minimalno plačo, nekateri morda dobivajo še manj, ampak je to tisto, s katerim pravzaprav ena družina normalno ne more uspešno preživeti. In to je tudi ta hud problem, da pravzaprav lahko govorimo tudi o tem, da so invalidi oziroma da se pojavlja revščina tudi med tistimi oziroma revščina, prak revščine ali nekako bi lahko rekla prak revščine, tudi med tistimi, ki so zaposleni, ne samo tisti, ki so brezposelni. Toliko bi o tem.
Ja, jaz bi preden dam besedo spet gospodu Cattaniju vprašal še to. Zdaj, vidimo, da smo tudi v moralni krizi, kjer padajo razni tabuji, sploh ko gre recimo za posege v določene pravice, ki so doslej veljale kot sami po sebi umevne in so bile stališča človečnosti tudi logične. Ali čutite na mestu, ki ga upravljate, da obstajajo zamisli, recimo naših oponaševalcev, čikaških fantov, da bi posegali tudi na področje invalidov?
Tukaj moram reči, da pravzaprav naš direktorat, ne glede na to, kakšna je kriza, nekako ohranja svoj proračun, ki ga ima. To se pravi, denarja na srečo za enkrat nam še ne jemljajo. In glede na sem, bom rekla, optimist in upam, da bo tako tudi v bodoče. Je pa res, da se vsi zelo trudimo, da ta denar tudi dejansko ohranimo in da pač speljemo programe, ki jih imamo začrtane. Tako da v tem trenutku, bom rekla, na našem direktoratu, ne bom rekla, seveda, boljš bi bilo, če bi imeli več denarja, to je normalno, to kdo pa tega ne bi želel imeti. Ampak vsaj v danih razmerah, bom rekla, ni korenitih rezov v te pravice, ki so invalidom že zagotovljene.
Dobro, to je spodbudno slišati. Upajmo seveda, da ne bo kdo prišel še na kakšne nore ideje. Ampak, če se vrnem k vam, gospod Cattani, Mr. Cattani, we heard also from the Slovenian point of view where we are, where we stand, what fears we have. But could you tell us now, how could we act realistically in the situation we have? It is a bad situation. It could be worse, as we heard, but we need to act in order to improve. What can all of us, what can everybody of us do to improve the situation we're in now, on the European level and also on the national levels?
Well, in general terms, I think that what is needed, first of all, is a shift from short-term measures to structural reforms in order to vitalize the economy. And despite the social situation has never been worse in Europe, in March, the heads of states agreed for the first time to reduce the EU budget by 7% starting by the next year. And this goes against what we are expecting and against the fact that we absolutely must, as I said before, strengthen the economy and not bringing it to a more negative situation. Now, if we look at the general situation, I said it is necessary to think about what in not many years ago had been called the European dream. Talking about European dream I remember the very nice and very interesting books of Jeremy Rifkin with this title. And the European dream was positive. The European dream was understood as an American journalist said very clearly that the European development was better for the future than the development of the US situation, the US economy. Now, it was in 2004. The crisis came, of course, in 2007, 2008, very strongly. But what the politicians, and maybe also the civil society, did not understand that against the crisis you must fight with ethical and you must fight with principles. And principles have to be considered absolute. So, a rights-based society cannot say that the rights of persons with disabilities or whatever citizen are submitted to the economic, let's say, sustainability. Economy has to follow the principles and not the interests and the limited in-time interests. So I think that, first of all, we must think about the fact that we had a dream and we should not leave this dream and adequate ourselves to another way of understanding life and progress, and to think about our vision to build a new society. And this vision is possible only if, as I said before, the participation of citizens is revitalized, and that the divide, the gap between citizens and political decision makers and institutions in general is overcome, could be overcome. If I think, for constraints of time, I have to speak about the situation of persons with disabilities in particular. And here we have an important instrument, and the instrument is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a convention that has been ratified by most of just 2 or 3 member states have not ratified this convention, but they say that they will do it. And it has been also ratified by the European Union. So for persons with disabilities, there is a strong instrument. There is an instrument which has to be implemented both at the European and member states level. Convention, which is the first convention that has been ever ratified by the European Union. This is also important. This gives an idea on how successful the disability movement has been in the past years. Now we see that the implementation is difficult because both the European Union, but especially the member states, try and delay the implementation of the convention. And this means that we stay with the old situation. I'm very happy that I heard that in Slovenia the system of the quota system is working. But in other countries, such as, for example, in France and in Germany, and also in Italy, unfortunately, the quota system is boycotted, both by the public authorities, but in particular by the entrepreneurs who prefer pay money instead of employing persons with disabilities. And the principle of the persons with disabilities, the last to be hired and the first to be fired, is still very, 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 you can find it in many countries, in many situations, also in Europe. The movement is now at European level very strong. In some countries it is also strong, in others less. But we see that if we ask for the implementation of the UN Convention, we go the right way, because there are the principles which, for persons with disabilities, make inclusion possible and the possibility to be realized. So I think that first, when persons with disabilities discuss with their governments, and the European Disability Forum discusses with the European Commission, when persons with disabilities discuss with political decision makers, they must have the UN Convention in mind. And all groups of persons with disabilities find in the Convention the solution to their problems. Persons with intellectual or cognitive problems, for the first time, are very clearly indicated to be rights holders. Maybe you know that there is a say that persons with disabilities are, let's say, just a moment.
You can say it in Slovenian if you want, but
persons who hold an impairment holders. This is the old way to understand disability. The new way to understand disability is the social way, and the social way says that a person is disabled due to the barriers existing in society. So if we say that persons with disabilities are rights holders, we say that these barriers have to be eliminated. And the UN Convention is the strong instrument which gives persons with disabilities the way to ask the decision makers in the member states and at the EU level also to take measures to really change the situation and to really dismantle the barrier. So from a barrier-full society to a barrier-free society. These, of course, are a little bit slogans, but we need slogans sometimes, as the fundamental slogan for persons with disabilities: nothing about us without us. No decision without consulting, no decision without supporting the participation.
Okay,
and just one word again, and recognizing the organizations of persons with disabilities as specific representative organizations, which is not the same as civil society organizations, but because this is a real representative bodies. Thank you.
Yeah, so if we do a to-do list or a checklist, what we have to do, so the general thing would be support on your national and also on the common European level the UN Convention. My question to the lady from the Slovenian directorate, kako stojimo s tem v Sloveniji, kako odločni smo pri uveljavljanju te konvencije Združenih narodov pri nas?
No, kar se tiče konvencije Združenih narodov o invalidih, bom rekla prvo to, da ena zadeva je, da je bila Slovenija ena med prvimi, ki je sicer konvencijo ratificirala. Rekla bom pa tudi to, da nas čaka kar precej dela še, da bomo dejansko implementirali to konvencijo. Prvi majhen korak naprej proti ratifikaciji konvencije je bil pravzaprav sprejem zakona o izenačevanju možnosti za invalide, ki je pravzaprav prvi poskus oziroma prvi delček mozaika, ki naj bi pomenil tudi samo implementacijo konvencije. Zavedamo pa se, da je tukaj ogromno dela še tako na polju dostopnosti, tako tudi pri izobraževanju, na drugih, pri zdravstvu, na drugih področjih in seveda mislim pa, da pač Slovenija ni edina, ki pravzaprav bomo šele morali pristopiti po naših najboljših močeh k sami ratifikaciji, mislim ne ratifikaciji, ampak implementaciji konvencije kot take.
Skratka, odločevalca moramo neprestano stati za podaljšanimi hrbti, da ne uporabim veliko krajše besede, spravi, to je to, kar v Sloveniji moramo narediti. Now, next question to Mr. Cattani when it comes to the to-do list. Are there very urgent, specific problems we face on the European level when it comes to providing equal opportunities for everybody? Are there some fields where we should really stand up and really do everything possible to improve the situation on very specific levels?
Yes, because if we look at the possibilities offered by the Convention, we also must consider that there are different possibilities and different engagements for the European Union in different fields. So employment, for example, is very important, and they have a fully competence in this area. But there are other areas where competence is just shared with member states. In any case, at European level, what we have achieved now is that we have created the so-called monitoring framework of the UN Convention, a body which is composed of the European Commission, a committee of the European Parliament, which is the Petition Committee, an agency on fundamental rights, which is an emanation of the Commission, which is the Fundamental Rights Agency, the European Ombudsman, and the European Disability Forum. And so far, the European Disability Forum has the presidency of this body, which is, of course, a consultative body. But every decision which is taken by the European Commission and the European institutions can be discussed and analyzed by this group, and there is a real need for the European institutions to take into consideration the positions of this monitoring framework. We also have achieved to have every year a meeting with the presidents of the European Union, of the European Council, and of the European Parliament. And there we put forward our problems and our demands. Another important aspect is that we have also the possibility to influence the European Parliament, because we have the secretariat of the intergroup, the disability intergroup of the European Parliament, which is a group of members of the Parliament who are specifically interested in disability problems. So at European level, we can, of course, within the limitations of what the European Union can do, we have a very strong influence. And if we consider that we work on regulations regulations are mandatory for member states. So I would recall the achievement of different regulation in the transport area. In the air transport, for example, when the rights of passengers with disabilities are protected. The railway transport, where there is also a regulation which is obligatory, which is compulsory for member states. On road transport, on sea and water transport, all these regulations have been adopted with the contribution of the European Disability Forum. We had important directives, like the directive on employment in the year 2000, the 2000 directive. We are, and here the music is more negative, we are expecting since 2007 the adoption of a directive, the so-called non-discrimination directive. Because non-discrimination now is guaranteed to persons with disabilities in the employment area, but there are many other areas where this non-discrimination clause is not foreseen. And then we are expecting, especially in the field of accessibility, you mentioned it before, we are expecting an important directive to ensure the accessibility of goods and services. This directive should have been, the proposal should have been put forward already at the beginning of this year, but it is delayed, and we don't know when it will be given.
Because this is very important, because we will have a European election next year in May. So in order to savor our right to vote, we will also need information. And for example, internet accessibility for blind people, for deaf people, for everybody is extremely important in getting needed information to know how to vote and who to support, especially in guaranteeing equal rights for everybody. So how far are we in this regard?
Now, the situation is as follows. The Commission has made a proposal, it has come out in December last year, and they have made a proposal saying that websites of public bodies should be made accessible. But what is the problem? That they have made a short list of these websites, and the list is so short, only 12 areas, that most of the websites, of the public websites, will not be obligatory to be made accessible. So now, this proposal is discussed in the Parliament, and the Parliament has made great progress and has changed the proposal according to our requests. EDF, the European Disability Forum, and the European Blind Union in particular. We are the most important fighters in this field. Then this will go to the Council, and the Council will be the final decision makers, and there we expect to have some countries being strongly reluctant to approve the text of the directive as it is now.
Why?
So, because they say that it is too expensive, and they say that the change of public websites in order for them to be accessible is very expensive. But our position is that never forget that there is a graduality of implementation, and that if we start making accessible the new websites, if we start with making accessible gradually all public, we cannot ask that they are immediately accessible start from tomorrow on. But the time is clear. What we are fighting for is the recognition of the principle and the recognition of the fact that with all limitations given by the reality, we must say that public bodies' websites must be accessible. Now, elections. The elections of the European Parliament will be the same as 4 years ago, which means that in each country, the voting rules existing in the country will be applied. So the European Parliament in Slovenia will be elected with the Slovenian rules. In Italy, the Italian rules, and in Germany, the German rules, which are very good. Because, for example, persons with disabilities are entitled to vote at home and to have a separate voting system in order to make it possible for them to vote in a high number, in a very high number, and they do. Now, in other countries it is more difficult because there are no rules. And I don't know the situation in Slovenia, but it will be the same as for the national parliament. The European Disability Forum has published a European Parliament manifesto where we put forward all our demands, accessibility of voting, but also, and I think this is very important because in general it is impossible to realize, and also for persons with disabilities to be candidates and to be supported in order to solve the practical problems they have, in order to be at the same level as the non-disabled candidates, putting materials in accessible format, giving the possibility to access the TV programs and to access all kind of public places where political debate is held, etc. We have just one persons with disability now in the European Parliament, just one. 751 members of the Parliament which will be elected next year. We will see how many persons with disabilities we will have. We want to have, if possible, the same representation in the Parliament of persons with disabilities as in society. And in society we know that persons with disabilities are 15% of the population. So if we have 10% MEPs with disabilities, it would just be an important result.
Okay, last but not least, before we turn to the audience, just one question, because you said that you've traveled all around the world and you know the situation also in other parts of the world. What could you tell us briefly about the situation of disabled people in other parts? We know that the Americans have their special act since 1990. How is the situation in China? Can we Europeans learn from them in a way? Has somebody good solutions which could be interesting for our part of the world?
Well, my personal idea is that every time everybody has to learn from other people and other situations. I think that the learning process is the process which gives the possibility to be in the right situation with the reality, to understand the reality, and also to understand the reasons why certain situations exist. So I think that we have to learn everywhere from the situations of our colleagues in countries. For example, for many years in Europe, the idea was that organizations or persons with disabilities should be included in a certain sense in the institutional framework of society. So there was a support given to these organizations, but the organizations were a little bit under control of the government and of the public, of the government, I would say. And this was especially the case in the previous system, the communist system, for example, where some organizations were very, very much developed and active. For example, the organization of blind and of deaf people, but other organizations, such, for example, those of also wheelchair users and especially persons with cognitive problems, were practically non-existing. The development that has been made in Europe in the last decades is that thanks to the shift from the individual-based concept of disability to the social model has practically changed radically the situation. And this principle has been produced outside Europe. This principle comes, for the first time, has been produced, for example, in the United States. And this is an example of how the situation can be contradictory. Because in the United States you have this wonderful principle, but you have a difficult situation for persons with disabilities because their unemployment is more or less the same as in Europe. But in the past in Europe we had a better employment of persons with disabilities. Now there is a recession of employment, and in the United States they never had a high level of employment, although the employment in the United States is much more differential. They do much more jobs as we do in Europe, because in Europe we have a little bit categorized the employment situation of persons with disabilities. In China, for example, China is a very large country. The organizations here in Europe, we have the biggest organizations have about 100,000 members, the big ones in the country. In China, there are millions of people participating in organizations. And this makes also the democratic participation more difficult. And there is a centralized development which can be good from a certain point of view, but the situation of political participation is limited, also in the organizations as in the political life in general. If we look at the differences in other countries, we see that Europe is still in a very, very good position, not only in those countries where you have war and you have strong fight, internal fight, but also in countries where it is relatively peaceful. I remember when I visited Saudi Arabia, for example. Yes, blind people were considered as people to be helped, not as people to be accepted in society at the same level as non-disabled people. And this is in many countries. And if we go to Africa, for example, we see that in some countries the movement is very strong. In South Africa, for example, the movement is very, very strong. In other countries it's difficult because there are different, also the history of the organizations of persons with disabilities differ, because in some countries there were leaders, very strong leaders. In other countries, leaders could not be found. And this is also very, very important. To make a conclusive remark, I would say that with all the problems and with all the difficulties that we are facing, but in Europe we are still in a good position with if we consider the comparison with other countries. But I would say that we can be we have a good basis to go and build a better future for us in Europe.
Yeah, we could do it, but not only could, we should do better.
Of course.
Jaz bi ne vprašala, ampak želela podati nekaj opažanj. In sicer, en mesec nazaj smo bili v Štartbergu, v Evropskem parlamentu, imeli smo pohod Freedom Drive v organizaciji Mreže za neodvisno življenje. Yes. Bili smo v parlamentu in prišlo nas je poslušati tanko 5 poslancev, čeprav so bili vsi v hiši, 800 in koliko. Noben ni imel časa, ker je bil ustavni tudi gospod Barovi in seveda mi smo pač drugorazredni državljani. Čeprav smo nekateri pripotovali 800 km in tako naprej. Naš poudarek kot letos je bila 10. obletnica tega plenarja je predvsem neodvisno življenje. In to vključuje prvo kot prvo posebno asistenco za vse tiste, ki jo potrebujejo. Teh je v Evropi še ogromno. V Evropi je še vedno prevladujoč način medicinskega modela. Še vedno se zelo veliko ljudi zapira v institucije, v totalne institucije. Še vedno se iz evropskih skladov črpa denar, da se te institucije obnavlja ali pa se na novo gradi. Skratka, situacija je predvsem bolj depresivna, kot se je opisal vi. Tudi svoboda gibanja ni zagotovljena. Kar je treba še poudariti, gospod Adam Kosler, ki je ta, o katerem ste govorili, edini predstavnik oziroma predsednik stability intervju, ni hotel videti oziroma se ni udeležil tega srečanja, ker pa je ni imel prevajalcev, grupo njem, čeprav je bil v hiši, ki smo mu zagotovili, da bi se nekako že sporazumeli. To je odnos Evropske unije, hočem reči, to je odnos, ki ga ima do skupine ljudi, ki bi mogla biti vzeta drugače obzir. Zato je s tem slovanjem zelo gre, za nas gre res s mislijo skrajno cinični. To je en vidik. Drugi vidik je nacionalni vidik. Slovenija je res med prvimi, da ratificira konvencijo in kaj potem? Nič, gospod Gular. Vam res ne vprašuje denarja, ampak to se nanaša na vas za posebne. Konvencija ni bila implementirana, prevod je katastrofalen, osnovni koncepti konvencije v angleščini so prevedeni po vsem slovenskim interpretacijam, staremu modelu, kar je imel gospod komunizma ali pa ja socializma, če hočete. Skratka, zimi, ki se vam omenila, ni mogo biti že 2 leti v veljavi, pa šli. Zakon o osebni asistenci, ki je bil prvi zakon, ki smo ga državljani pač dali v parlament z ljudsko inicijativo, je bil zavrnjen. Zakaj je bil zavrnjen? Ne zaradi krize. Tudi zaradi meseca takratni. Minister mu je pač odredil podporo in seveda je bil neizglasovan v parlamentu. Tako da govoriti o krizi so do nekem stanju za spravičilo, da se danes stanje se mi zdi res neprimerno, ker v bistvu v Sloveniji so 20 leti nič bistvenega v glavah tisti, ki oblikujejo politiko, ne spremenijo. In jaz mislim, jaz se strinjam, gospodom Cattani, da moramo biti aktivni. Mi smo zelo aktivni, da bomo še bili, da bomo težili do nezavesti, če bo treba. Ampak hočem reči, da to se nam že zmanjkuje ideje. Rekli smo, ravno če smo meni, da to tema zastane, še 2 leti bomo šli v Evropski parlament in bomo zasedli Evropski parlament. Ko mi hodimo po cesti, poslanci ne slišijo naših sloganov. In ko gremo v parlament, moramo naše plakate pustiti od zunaj, obravnavani in pregledali se tako, kot da smo prišli tam, kot da smo televiziji, skratka varnost je strašljiva. In potem seveda, kot sem omenila, nobenega ni bilo. Tudi bomo zasedli Evropski parlament in bomo tam skakljali z našimi aparati, tako da bojo poslanci videli, kaj je to živeti skakljati na naš način. Vsak evropski poslanec ima pravico do 3 asistentov plačanih z Evropskega parlamenta, iz našega denarja školjko, ne? Mi pa ne. Pri nas to je pa ljudje, ki so stari 20 let, let v dom postarine. In to ministrstvo v tej državi in v večini držav Evrope dovoljuje. To je potem.
Najlepša hvala, Irena.
Hvala lepa, pozdravljeni še z moje strani. Moje ime je Tomaž Vraber in sem trenutno predsednik Zveze društev spletnih slovenih Slovenije. Vesel sem, da lahko pozdravimo v Ljubljani gospoda Cattanija in seveda tudi gospodula, ki se odzvala na pogovor in da je ta pogovor zdaj stekel, ker lahko odpremo celo vrsto tem, zaprli jih bomo manj. Ampak vendarle, če se o njih pogovarjamo, če razmislimo, bomo najbrž našli tudi neke možne rešitve. Prva stvar, ki bi jo rad poudaril, je to, da seveda, kadar je družba v krizi, naša družba je, evropska družba je in svetovna družba je v krizi, je prav, da tudi invalidi delimo to krizo. Ampak, če že nujno res nekatere pravice omejevati, bi bil edini možni princip to, da se te pravice začasno omejijo, ne pa da se krizo izrabi za to, da se striže neke pravice, da se ukinja, in potem nikoli več ne bo. To je prva zgodba, ki se mi zelo pomembna. Naslednja, ki sledi iz te, je seveda to, da bi morali vsi se zavedati, ne samo invalidi, ampak celotna družba, da je ves denar, ki ga država vloži v socialno področje, da mi ponavadi razumemo kot strošek, kar je po mojem naziranju popolnoma narobe. Denar, vložen v socialo, je investicija. In to bi celo postati ena najboljših investicij, ki jih družba lahko pozna. Jaz sem bil v ZDA in zato mi je všeč, da je gospod Cattani spregovoril o Chicago Boys in vem, da v ZDA so ljudje smrtno preplašeni kar naprej, skozi so v nekem hektičnem stanju zaradi občutka, da lahko vsak hip izgubijo zaposlitev, izgubijo svojo socialno varnost, možnost preživetje. In Evropa se vsi gledali iz Amerike kot na prostor, kjer so vsaj osnovne socialne pravice toliko zagotovljene, da lahko preživiš. To je tisti moralni generator za drugo, ki je neverjetno pomemben. In tretja stvar, ki bi jo rad poudaril, je to, spet ne bom povedal nič novega. Koliko imam spominju, so se v Sloveniji začele pravzaprav dogajati neke tektonske spremembe zakonodaje, tam okoli leta 2007, celo pred začetkom krize. Ampak te spremembe, predvsem v socialni zakonodaji, se niso dogajali tako, da bi bilo vsakomor najmanj pa nam, ki se ne zelo tičejo, se pravi invalidov, ki smo na nek način tudi odvisni od tega področja dela, jasen končni cilj. Edino, kar smo videli, je to, da gre za izrazito okrnjevanje vlaganj v socialo in za izrazito krčenje invalidskih pravic. In čeprav smo večkrat pozvali Nacionalni svet invalidskih organizacij Slovenije, naj zahteva z manifestom od vlade, od vseh vlad, kajti tukaj so bile vlade najrazličnejših barv skoraj enake, da nam razložijo, kakšen bo končni rezultat realizacije teh sprememb, do te vizije nismo prišli. In zato trdim, da moramo mi postaviti svojo vizijo, da jo moramo oblikovati in da moramo z njo prodelati in prepričevati javnost, da je prava. In končal bom z mislijo, ki ravno tako ni nova, ki sem jo že večkrat ponovil, ampak sem globoko prepričal, da drži. Vsak od nas, ki je kadarkoli postal invalid ali pa se je rodil invalid, in da to na nek način zanj največja življenjska kriza. Ampak ta kriza, kot vse krize in tudi na naša ekonomska kriza, svetovna ekonomska kriza, je v naših glavah, je vedno v človeških glavah. In ravno invalidi smo tisti, za katere sem prepričan, da smo dokazali, da pravzaprav te krize sploh nekako težko premagati. Torej, nehajmo govoriti o krizi, začnimo govoriti o viziji. Ko bomo imeli vizijo, to je tisto, če se ne motim, ko je gospod Cattani rekel, imeli smo sanje. Da se zadnje bi to veselo tudi lahko spremenil vizijo in mislim, da je to isto. Imamo pravico do vizije in do sanj, imenimo to vizijo in jo realiziramo. In nenadoma bomo opazili, da pravzaprav krize ni, ali pa da se vso razumemo z lahkoto. Hvala.
Sam seveda bi mogoče podaril še en vidik, ki je tudi pomemben, namreč dostop ljudi s posebnimi potrebami do kulture. Sam se seveda ukvarjam z kulturo, s književnostjo in seveda tudi z drugimi oblikami kulture, vsaj posredno v bolj producentskem smislu, konkretno lani v okviru prestolnice kulture, hkrati pa sem seveda tudi sam 100% invalid. In mislim, da je seveda dostop do kulture izjemno pomemben za ljudi s posebnimi potrebami, da omogoča pravzaprav neko res enakopravno vključitev v družbo. Ni seveda to edina točka vključitve, pa vendar le zelo pomembna. Zato bi mogoče na tem mestu posebej poudaril prizadevanja zveze Društva slepih in slabovidnih in predvsem predsednika Tomaža Vraberja, da se vzpostavi s pomočjo evropskih sredstev digitalna knjižnica za slepe in slabovidne, kar mislim, da je izjemno pomemben premik na slovenskem prizorišču. Hkrati pa mislim, da bi bilo potrebno sistematično urediti področje dostopnosti kulture za ljudi s posebnimi potrebami, tako fizične dostopnosti, digitalne dostopnosti, kot seveda tudi, kadar je potrebno, vsebinske dostopnosti. In rekel bi odkrito rečeno, da na samem Ministrstvu za kulturo, na njegovem oddelku, je bilo seveda veliko narejeno, hkrati pa obstaja še veliko rezerv, predvsem v smislu pospešitve tega procesa, najprej mapiranja, stanja, ki vemo, da velikokrat je drugačno v praksi, kot se kaže na papirju, da so na papirju stvari pogosto bolj urejene, v praksi pa ne funkcionirajo, in seveda v smislu sprejetja konkretnih ukrepov, v smislu raznolike dostopnosti. To je na nek način odraz stanja družbe. Velikokrat imamo stvari na papirju, imamo konvencije, imamo različne formalnosti, da je formalnosti zadoščeno, pa vendar le v praksi smo še precej daleč. Potrebni so zelo konkretni, jasni, hitri koraki, kajti ne nazadnje viri, če je volja za to obstaja Evropski socialni sklad in pravzaprav zgolj odločitev politike in vseh drugih odločevalcev je tista, ki lahko stvari usmeri. Prej je bilo izpostavljeno ravno recimo prilagajanje spletnih strani javnih institucij. Sam sem bil šokiran, ko sem denimo ugotovil, da nekaj ena, vsaj ne vem, če ima katera fakulteta na slovenskem nima prilagojene strani recimo za slepe in slabovidne. Tudi kulturne institucije z mogoče nekaj izjemami tega nimajo. In tako naprej. Stroški, o katerih je bilo govora, seveda so, ampak niso tako enormni, to lahko potrdim iz lanskega primera Evropske predstavnice kulture. Spet z angažiranjem konkretnih strukturnih fondov bi se dalo tem stvarem zadostiti. Vendar kot v vsaki družbi se treba tudi v naši vprašati o prioritetah in o vrednotah, ki to družbo pravzaprav poganjajo. Hvala lepa.
Hvala lepa. Še eno mnenje, prosim.
Pa me zanima, so kakšni inštrumenti nadzora predvideni za izvajanje Konvencije Združenih narodov o pravicah invalidov na ravni Evropske unije in kdo ta nadzor izvaja pri nas. Se strinjam tudi s predhodnikom, spokrivam predvsem področje okvar sluha. Konvencija o pravicah invalidov predvideva veliko dobrih in konkretnih rešitev tudi za osebe z okvaro sluha, pa vendarle se v praksi zdi, da konvencija ni obvezna, da nima statusa zakona, čeprav je bila ratificirana leta 2008, tudi ne predvideva nikakršnih kazni, sankcij pa inšpektorjev. Pa me zanima morda mnenje gospoda sekretarja in gospoda Tulerja. Hvala lepa.
Okay. What is your answer, Mr. Cattani?
Okay. Sorry. The UN Convention has a clear monitoring and implementation system. It's Article 33 of the Convention. And in every political reality, now, member state or in European Union, there should be two important bodies. The so-called focal point, and the focal point is, in simple words, the coordination center of all the activities that are developed on a certain level for persons with disabilities. So, there will be a national focal point. In some countries, such as in Germany, every land will have a focal point because in the Länder you have the possibility, you have some competencies to be respected. Also in other countries where the regional governments are having specific duties, like in Italy, for example, there should be a focal point. And this is the organization, the body, which represents the government, so to say. On the other hand, we have the monitoring body which is foreseen and which in principle should be made up of under the responsibility of the organizations of persons with disabilities. So these two bodies, the first one, the focal point, must present every 2 years a report to a special committee of the United Nations on the Convention, and this committee will then analyze the report and express the views, its views on this report. On the other hand, the monitoring group and every organization of persons with disabilities, even private persons could submit to the same committee the so-called alternative or parallel report. And this report is considered by the committee with the same attention and as the report from the government. And when it comes to examine these reports, both the representatives of the government and of those who have sent the parallel or alternative report are invited to Geneva, and there is an open public discussion on this. So, what should the Organization of Persons with Disabilities control in each of the member states, if there is a focal point, and if there is the possibility for the organizations to develop the monitoring activity. I give you an example. A positive example is for example, in Spain, where the focal point has been organized by the government, and the monitoring body has been identified in the National Council of Persons with Disabilities, which is an official body, supported also financially by the government. And there has been two reports, one of the government and one of the monitoring body, and they have been, of course they are not the same. The evaluation is very different. And there are already in Europe, Austria has made this way, Italy is going this way. But, for example, Italy is not a good example, because when ratifying the convention, the parliament constituted a so-called observatory. And in this observatory, the focal point and the monitoring body are included and mixed up, so that it is very difficult for the organizations to prepare an alternative report, because they had to contribute also to the national report. And so the government says, now, you have contributed in the preparation, why do you criticize us now? So this is an example of negative approach. If you allow me, the previous comments we had.
Okay.
The colleague from Enil has perfectly right. The European Disability Forum has a specific body, has created a specific body to fight against institutionalization. It's a very difficult word, but I will try to say it. The de-institutionalization is one of the priorities of the European Disability Forum. But we should not forget that behind institutionalization there are very strong economic lobbies, very strong systems which work against the deinstitutionalization, and it is to register that there has been a slight advance in the field, but far away from being satisfactory. The European Parliament very often refuses to receive organizations of persons with disabilities due to, they say, their engagement. It is very difficult to have meetings in the Parliament, and also you mentioned the security measures. They are but they are for all. They are not only for persons with disabilities. So I would say persons with disabilities are not considered at the same level as terrorists. We are lucky of this, of course. Now, in any case, the persons represented by the organizations for independent living are one of the groups which are in most difficult situation. Other groups are better placed. And this is also why European Disability Forum has created has put a special priority on this, and also created a special working group. Considering culture, yes, Article 30 of the Convention makes cultural participation a right for persons with disabilities. So no doubt that books must be accessible. No doubt that TV programs must be accessible with audio description for blind people and subtitling for persons with hearing problems. That, in general, museums are made accessible. That all kind of activities, start from sports to cultural music and whatever, should be accessible for persons with disability. This is very, very important. And I think in this area, if there is goodwill, the financial and economic problems are not so high. It's not so difficult to guarantee accessibility in a stadium or in a theater or whatever. Just there must be the political sensibility and the political will. My friend Thomas said the crisis is more in the heads of people than in reality. I would be very happy, Thomas, if it would be true, but sometimes you see the situation is much more difficult than we would like to say. So I think that we must be very careful not to underestimate the effects of the crisis on the living conditions of the general public, but of persons with disabilities in particular. So I think that this is more or less what I can answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cattani. Slovenia is also a country where ladies have the final word, so I'll give the floor to Mrs. Duller to answer the question of my colleague.
Ja, hvala lepa tudi z moje strani za vprašanje. Povedala bom tako. V Sloveniji naj bi izvajanje konvencije spremljal svet vlade, svet za invalide. To naj bi bil je tripartitni organ, ki ga sestavljajo predstavniki invalidskih organizacij, predstavniki inštitucij, ki se širše ukvarjajo s področjem invalidskega varstva in pa s predstavniki države. Ta svet, svet je predviden po zakonu o izenačevanju možnosti invalidov in je ravno sedaj v fazi ustanavljanja, naj bi pa nasledil bivši svet vlade Republike Slovenije za invalide. To naj bi bil pač nek organ, ki bo spremljal samo izvajanje konvencije. Vprašali ste pa tudi recimo direktno glede inšpekcijskih služb in tega, bom rekla pa tako. Sama konvencija pravzaprav tega ne predvideva in tudi zaradi tega za izvajanje same konvencije pravzaprav se ne bo zagotovljenih nekih inšpekcijskih služb. Je pa jasno, da ko bo pač določeni deli konvencije, ko bodo implementirani v našo zakonodajo, potem se pa lahko v področnih zakonih pa uredi ustrezen inšpekcijski nadzor ob kršenju seveda norm, ki bodo temeljile na konvenciji. Hvala.
Najlepša hvala za ta odgovor. Vsekakor vsi upamo, da, ko ste rekli, ko bodo implementirani, da se bo to zgodilo čim prej in da vsi skupaj lahko k temu tudi veliko pripomoremo. Najlepša hvala vsem za sodelovanje. Thank you very much, Mr. Cattani, for your kind cooperation here. I think there are still questions, but you can answer them directly in the minutes to come. Hvala lepa še enkrat vsem. Želimo vam veliko uspeha in seveda veliko odločnosti v skupnem boju za našo skupno enakost. Hvala in nasvidenje.